All right, we ready to start? Okay, hi, my name is David Brown, and I'd like to welcome you to our program, YPO Presents. I'm co-president of Grand Pacific Resorts, and I'm a 23-year member of the Young Presidents Organization. One of the benefits of YPO is the ability to join YPO networks, which are private members-only communities that connect YPO members by industry and by personal interest. It's a great way to connect on a deeper level and create deeper relationships through virtual and in-personal learning and events. One of YPO's personal interest networks is the LGBTQ network, which has been an active network in YPO for almost 20 years. We currently have 130 members worldwide, all CEOs or presidents of their companies, and we're growing by about 5 new members a month. As the current chair of the LGBTQ network, I'm proud to lead our group of LGBTQ global leaders, and they really are global, who embrace the challenge of building diverse and inclusive organizations and who are truly committed to implementing solutions that drive change in the real world. So today, our network is thrilled to bring you this discussion around creating and nurturing diversity and inclusion in the workplace, led by Todd Sears, the founder and principal of Outleadership. Outleadership is the global LGBTQ business network trusted by CEOs and multinational companies to drive return on equality. Todd and his team create executive events and insights that help businesses realize the economic growth and talent dividend from inclusion. Outleadership convenes 3 groundbreaking talent accelerators. First is Out Next, which is the first global leadership development program for the next generation of LGBTQ talent. Second is Quorum, which seeks to advance the conversation around LGBTQ diversity in corporate governance. And third is Out Women, which convenes and celebrates LGBTQ women in business. Thank you for your time, and let me turn it over to my good friend, Todd Sears.
Thanks, Doug. David, really appreciate the kind introduction and also the opportunity to be with everyone here today. Originally, interestingly, I was going to be a presenter at your San Diego conference. So I would have been right there with David. And unfortunately, the pandemic obviously changed plans for that. But I'm really excited to lead this conversation today with Linnea and Doug. And before we do that, I want to kind of set the context for why this conversation matters and what we're going to hope to uncover here in the next 55 minutes or so. If you're in California or in the United States, you might have seen yesterday that Governor Gavin Newsom signed a piece of legislation for California requiring diversity of boards who do business in the state. And that's groundbreaking. It's the first state to do so. But what I'm really excited about and proud of is that LGBTQ is included in that definition of diversity for the state of California. Now that's on the heels of CalPERS, CalSTRS, New York City, and New York State all amending their guidelines for diversity investments to include LGBTQ as well. I share that because that's one of Outleadership's initiatives, Quorum, that's been driving that for the last 6 and 7 years. And the way that that has been able to be driven is specifically through Outleaders. It's through people who are being out in their workplaces, being out in their communities, and leveraging the platform that they have to drive change from a business perspective. And as we're thinking about that globally, I want to set a global context, and then we'll talk a little bit about the US, and then we're going to dive into Linnea and Doug. Globally, in 67 countries, it is still illegal in some way, shape, or form to be LGBTQ. In the United States, obviously, we had a great ruling from the Supreme Court this last June that prohibited discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in employment, but it did not cover public accommodation, housing, and a myriad of other challenges that LGBTQ people still face in all 50 states. Everything from HIV criminalization to conversion therapy to being able to be evicted to even changing your birth certificate or driver's license to match your gender identity. All of those are still challenges that Americans face all over the country and globally. And my framework from an Outleadership perspective is I want businesses and CEOs to leverage the economic platforms they have to drive change, to say that discrimination in Singapore is bad for business, and therefore the Singapore government should pay attention and change. And I want the businesses doing business in Mississippi or Michigan to say LGBT inclusion needs to be on the docket, and it makes me able to do better business. And so I want to start with that as a context, and I'm going to introduce Linnea and Doug to kind of talk through both their journeys and their experiences as out leaders. They have both been out leaders in different contexts. They, like I, are also entrepreneurs. And I wanted to really sort of see if we can tease out some of the learnings that they've had, some of the impact that they have both made in very different spheres. And as I think you've used these platforms before, we're encouraging folks to ask questions, and they'll be sent to me as the moderator, and I will try to feed them into the conversation. So with that, Linnea, Doug, welcome. Thank you for being here. I'm going to first start with Linnea and let her introduce herself. But before I do, I want to give a little introduction on my own. Linnea and I have been friends and colleagues for over 10 years. And it's been such an exciting pleasure to watch her not just grow and be successful at Bank of America, but now in her new role as the CEO of Cokewool, which was formerly the Center for Talent Innovation. She has taken not just her career to new heights, but she is making significant change in the world. So Linnea, thank you and welcome. And I'll let you introduce yourself, and then I'll introduce Doug. I think you're muted, Linnea. There you go.
Great. Are we all here? Fantastic. Linnea Irvin, president at Cokewool, a 16-year-old think tank that conducts research and advises companies on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I spent many years on Wall Street, like Todd, all of that time in global banking and markets, most of that time in equities, leading strategic initiatives and covering hedge funds and asset managers cross-product, where I championed diversity, equity, and inclusion from my business seat. I currently chair the Human Rights Campaign's National Advisory Council, the forum of leaders collaborating across industry to advance inclusion goals for HRC, for LGBT employees globally. And of course, I've been a committed member of the Out Leadership community for many years. And I'm delighted to be here and be part of this conversation.
Thank you, Linnea. Doug is the founder of Volo, as well as a husband, father, and we just found out this morning, new puppy owner, a succession of puppies. And Volo, if you're not familiar, obviously was the goal to make the airport experience a little bit tipsier / a little bit more enjoyable. And Doug sold the company a number of years ago. And so excited to hear a little bit more about Doug's background, and then we're going to dive into some of the conversation. So Doug, welcome.
Thank you, Todd. It's really great to be here. I founded Volo almost 15 years ago and left a job in management consulting doing strategy work. Before that, actually worked in Tokyo in Japanese for Hitachi, helping them with their international operations. So I've had a chance to be in a lot of different industries and cultures through my career. And just happy to be where I am today and grateful for all the privilege I've been given. My husband, Chris Hall, and I have been together for about 20 years, and he's just about to start a CEO role in a week or two. So a pretty busy household with our two kids in second grade and kindergarten and a new puppy.
And I assume you're having to do the virtual learning with the kiddos, and suddenly you're a professor as well as a father and a dog parent. Is that
also an up and coming Zoom school advocate?
I love it. Well, I want to start with actually some commonality in both of your backgrounds, right? You started both in a corporate space, so Hitachi, Bank of America, and now you're both entrepreneurs. And so I want to sort of see if you can share with us a little bit of the difference in terms of being out in a corporate space and what that was like for both of you. And I'm curious if that even led towards you being more of an entrepreneur. There's data that shows that diverse folks, people of color, LGBTQ people, because corporate environments cannot be as welcoming sometimes, actually are more likely to become entrepreneurs. So I'm curious if that sort of effect potentially factored into your decision to be more entrepreneurial. So Linnea, I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Doug.
Great. Well, I think and you're exactly right. Data does show that you find more Black talent, women, LGBT leaders looking to start their own ventures because of experiences in corporate workplace, and definitely have some data I might be able to share later about that. But in my career, I think it's interesting because I had tremendously positive experiences in large corporate spaces, right? During my career, I've always been engaged in transforming workplace culture across Wall Street and more broadly. And because of that, I found it tremendously helpful over time because I built relationships and was able to partner with activists, corporate leaders, change agents, like you, Todd, who were also committed, who were sitting in the business, but also committed to the work. And so, we were doing our own type of entrepreneurial work, our own, kind of activism on the side, if you will, that made the work that I was doing on a day-to-day digestible, right? When we think about the impact that we may or may not be making in our business seats and the impact that we would like to make. I moved through, and I still do move through, corporate environments acutely aware of my, kind of intersectional identity as a Black body, as a female body, as an out LGBT person. And in large corporate, during my time at the bank, again, we learn very quickly, what it's like to be the first or only Black body in the room, right? The only female of your title on the desk. When you're managing teams domestically, globally, realizing that perhaps someone is being managed by a Black person for the first time, or being led by a female or an LGBT person for the first time. And that may seem fairly innocuous to some, but it does shape your interactions, right? And it required me to be acutely aware, have this heightened awareness as to how I was going to cultivate culture in a much larger culture, right? You're not just focusing on a book of business, you're focusing on managing bias and someone else's lack of exposure. And so, my move into, entrepreneurship and the seat I'm in today was pretty organic in that, I've been doing diversity and inclusion work. Obviously, I'm, a fan of the research that the organization has done for the past 16 years. And I was able to bring that business or commercial lens to this work, this really critical work. But I'm often thinking about my experiences in larger corporate spaces and ensuring that, I'm prioritizing the type of environment that I foster for our teams. I'm prioritizing, the way that I ensure the leaders within our organization, the emerging talent within our organization feel and know that they're seen, their contributions are recognized. And so I think I'm taking some of those learnings from, a decade of experience or so in a hyper productive large corporate environment and applying that in this more entrepreneurial environment.
So I want to key on something that you said, though, and I'm interested in this as you're talking about sort of activism on the side and also being the first Black body, female body, LGBTQ leader. And there's this sort of risk reward analysis that I think LGBTQ leaders have to go through in the sense of, do you come out? How do you come out? How do you show up? And are you willing to, as you did at Bank of America, take the risk to put yourself out there, to push the company to make change, to be more inclusive? And, I know from your background, you were one of the leaders of getting Bank of America to sign on for the amicus briefs for marriage equality and don't ask, don't tell. And that was a big challenge for a bank like Bank of America, I think, because if I remember correctly, the board of directors had to actually amend the charter of the organization to be able to sign on for marriage equality. That's not a small thing. How did you then and maybe now look at the risk of not just being out because you show up as a Black body, a female body, but you don't necessarily have to show up as LGBT. That's a choice, right? So, and that's a risk. How do you sort of square that? And what was the thought process that you went through?
Well, you bring up a great point because there are trade-offs, right? LGBTQ talent, day in, day out, they're in and out of the closet, right? Based on the interaction. And I think while at Bank of America, I had to decide what trade-offs to my authenticity I was going to make. And I had to decide that early on, right? So of course you focus on output, you focus on, offering meaningful contributions to your business, great. But for me, there was a tremendous amount of covering. And you may remember this, Todd, years ago, I wore, straightened my hair, I wore silk blouses and pearls and hyper feminized, right?
Same.
So that
Exactly. I totally.
so I did that, though, that because it was for me, it was, I mean, think about Wall Street 10, 15 years ago. It was finding a way to diminish one additional headwind, right? As a Black woman, a female body person, but as an out LGBT person, I didn't wear menswear and pocket squares and tailored suits and ties to work until I was much more senior. And so there was that covering. But because of that, I made an intentional choice not to, not to make any other trade-offs to my authenticity. So I did engage in advancing LGBT inclusion at the firm across Wall Street, right? I was still covering in the way that I performed my gender, let's say. But at the same time, I knew that I wanted to prepare the industry to be more welcoming and better equipped to invite LGBT talent that would come in after me. And so, yes, the bank did not sign on to amicus briefs or what they called social issues. And we had to run that up the chain and see, where we wanted to be when it came to the right side of history. And ultimately, the firm and multiple firms across the street, as you know, 30 or so, were able to sign on to that Morgan Lewis brief for federal marriage.
Yeah, which was more than any other industry, Wall Street supported marriage equality, which is something that I know we're both very proud to have been a part of. So thank you for that. Doug, I want to shift to you for a second. And I'm curious, similar to Linnea, so at Hitachi, I'm going to guess, based off of my experience with Japanese firms, that probably they weren't signing on to briefs. And, at the time that you were there, it might have been some of the same covering that Linnea was describing. Can you talk a little bit about your experience in the corporate space and, again, sort of how that brought you to the entrepreneurial?
Sure. Not only did I work for Hitachi in Tokyo, but I did it in the 90s, which was sort of like working for an American company in the 70s. And to say that I was covering would be ambitious. I was completely closeted at the beginning of my career at Hitachi. The idea of coming out, I just didn't have the courage for it. It would have been truly radical. And so hopefully I'm a story of, if not inspiration, at least some forgiveness for people, that you have to start somewhere and you don't have to be the amazingly brave, super out person at the beginning of your career to make a difference. I was really struck by your recent study that said in your organization, you found that 58% of LGBTQ people still are closeted and not out to their coworkers, which is really sad to me in the United States, that's where we are, even with all the efforts we put forth. So I started my career completely closeted in a culture that had no support for any form of diversity and inclusion, LGBTQ, gender equality, racial, there was none of it. So I was really in about as dark a place as you can get on this front. And I remember how much being authentic in the workplace made me feel isolated and alone. And so I ended up coming back to the United States in spite of being on a really great trajectory with Hitachi, because of my fortune of being really the only native English speaker going through the lifetime employment system out of the headquarters. I had pretty much my pick of future leadership roles laying out for me in the company, and I had no interest in it because I knew I couldn't be my authentic self without making some very brave decisions I wasn't ready to make. So I moved into management consulting in the United States, where I felt, well, maybe here I can be a little bit more authentic and have more control over who I am. And even there, I still didn't have the courage to come out to some of my clients when I was working in San Antonio, Texas, for example. I covered, and I didn't talk about my personal life, so that even though all of my colleagues at Deloitte knew that I was gay, the client in many cases did not. And my coming out and being authentic process really took a long time. And I do suppose that it would have been more powerful if I had moved more quickly. But I think the tale is a guide that to get to somewhere meaningful, you have to take one step at a time. So when I started Vino Volo, I think part of the reason I started it, other than I thought it was a great idea, was that I knew that if I was running the company, I would not be beholden to somebody else's cultural decisions and reliant on support networks to be there or not there for me to move forward. That I wouldn't have to cover to get access to all the white male privilege that was out there. I could actually create my own culture and not be beholden to anyone. Well, the reality was then I found out I still was beholden to my investors. And so I found myself covering during initial investor pitches. Because if you're talking to someone for 30 minutes, it's pretty easy to not bring in your personal life into the conversation. So it was a matter of, it was a convenience / cowardice play to not bring it up at that time. And it was really only after Vino Volo was pretty far along and fairly well beloved that I started realizing that not just being out to my organization, but being out to investors and being out to everyone was really important and in many ways a responsibility that I had given my position. So at the end of Vino Volo, not only did people in the company constantly hear about my kids and my husband and everything else, I brought my whole self to work, but we were very actively trying to make sure everybody else would bring their whole selves to work too and make it a truly inclusive culture. And that can be done in subtle or more blatant ways. So one of our campaigns we did to our customers to really tell them that this matters to us was we put these very large posters into all the stores to talk about wine is for everyone. And the poster that I ended up being on for Thanksgiving was from my family to yours, I wish you a happy Thanksgiving. And it said Doug Tomlinson, husband and father, and it had me and my husband Chris and our 2 kids in a 4 foot by 6 foot poster plastered in stores from Nashville to New Orleans. And I think these little choices that you make can have a profound impact on how the world inside your company and outside your company view the welcomeness to be supported and be your authentic self at work. So I think we can all make change, and I think it takes time to get to doing something noteworthy, but it's really one step at a time if you want to walk a mile.
I totally agree. I mean, several comments actually. I think LGBTQ people, and I think you're an example is what you just said, are very hard on ourselves for our coming out journey and timing. I would argue that in the 90s, very few people were comfortable being out because of the discrimination and fear of losing your job. So it wasn't that you were a coward, it was that you were protecting your livelihood and your career. And that's unfortunately the time in which we came up in the world. When I started on Wall Street in the late 90s, my boss used the faggot word on the floor all the time. So I'd come out and I went back in the closet for my first job because I knew that I couldn't be out. And then ultimately when I switched investment banks, I said I would be out in the interview, and I was out ever since. And I ultimately got called once in the Wall Street Journal the gayest man on Wall Street, which I wore with pride. But that was a journey, and everyone has their own. So I would encourage you not to feel bad about that time period, because you really had little choice. And ultimately, I would fault the company and the corporate environments that we all lived in at that time as the reason that people didn't feel comfortable being themselves. The second comment I would
agree with you, Todd. I don't want to misconstrue that I feel bad about how far out I was at the time. I agree. I just wanted to give people some space to forgive themselves, that it's a step at a time. But I do think that making yourself uncomfortable, like I was actually really uncomfortable when I put that poster up. Is it my right? I have shareholders. Is it my right to make this an issue for our company, for our brand? And I really had a soul struggle to push myself to be brave enough to say, no, it is my right and my responsibility to make myself uncomfortable and actually make a difference. I think that really all of this inclusion is about making ourselves a little bit uncomfortable one step at a time.
Well, and if you were a straight male, having your wife on a poster would not even be a question, right? No. So, the heteronormative world in which we live influences that decision in your head as well. So hopefully, but also the impact that you made, if, a little kid in Nashville sees a gay couple having kids through this poster as he's walking through the airport or she's walking through the airport, that's a huge impact that you would never have known, but by being a visible out leader, you create it. Well, you both talked about covering, and I want to talk a little bit about that. We've got a question from someone on Facebook that we're going to get to, and then we're going to talk about allies and what people in these workplaces need to be doing. So first, let's talk about covering, and then let's go to these questions from Facebook. you both mentioned covering, and just for those in the audience who may not know, the concept of covering is hiding an aspect of your identity in the workplace to fit into the norm. So Linnea talked about how she dressed. You could talk about how you do your hair. If you have an accent, the timbre of your voice. People lower their voice to sound more masculine or up the pitch of their voice to sound more feminine. All of those are covering behaviors. And the example that's always fun to use is Margaret Thatcher. When she got into politics, she was told that she sounded like a fishmonger's wife and that she gesticulated with her hands too much. And so if you listen to Margaret Thatcher, she always has her hands, they don't move, she stares straight ahead, and she has a very crisp British accent. That's a covering behavior because she needed to do that to fit into the norm. LGBTQ people do this, straight white men do this, people of color do this, everyone covers, which is why I think it's such a universal experience of feeling different. And Doug, as you said, it's the pushing the boundary there. About 80% of LGBTQ people who are out at work still cover an aspect of their identity at work. So it's not just about being out. And as Linnea said, gay people have to come out all the time, but also being able to bring your whole self, which is a bit of a cliche sometimes, but is a truism. And uncovering is how you do that. So I'd love for both of you to reflect on maybe even in current day, where you still feel like you cover. Because I think it's a useful example. I think people think, oh, this was 15 years ago, you had to navigate this. But in the current reality in which we live, this is still a challenge. So, Linnea, you first, and then Doug.
Gosh, in current day, I mean, ultimately, I like to believe that I'm unapologetically Black, female-bodied, and out. But again, I'm sure I'm covering right now in that I have natural hair. And I blow dry my hair straight, right? I flat iron my hair, and instead of wearing it curly. A common microaggression that you will find Black women experience is, individuals touching their hair without permission, right? And so one thing that I choose to do and have my entire career is to wear my hair straight at work. I might wear it curly on vacation. I might do something different if I'm visiting family, but I always straighten it. That's a form of covering.
Yep. And from your research, from Center for Talent Innovations research, I think 4 years ago with Kenji Yoshino, 89% of Black women report doing exactly what you just described.
Mm-hmm. That is correct.
Doug, how about you? In what ways do you feel like you still cover in your sort of current reality?
Well, I think I want to answer this a little bit obliquely. The obvious covers are acting straight or acting what seems straight when there's a party that wants to act more gay. But I think what I would like to talk about is the idea of covering is really about norming and trying to look and act like everyone else and trying to make your backstory sound as similar as everyone else, which effectively means not being your authentic self. And I think that even straight allies can relate to this, that this idea that you've had a death in the family and you have to go to work and pretend like everything is fine. The idea that there was a Black Lives Matter protest that you attended and it's really jarred you and you feel like you're not allowed to talk about that headspace at work. I think this form of covering is problematic for productivity and problematic for feeling included and like you belong, because that's where your heart is, and your work is not where your heart is. And so I think making cultures more inclusive where people can bring their whole selves to work. And everybody has a whole self, and there are all kinds of aspects of whole self that even straight white men of privilege have that they don't bring to work, like their autistic son was acting up on their way to school today. And by covering all of those truths of people's lives, you end up with employees only half at work. And so I think the key is to make sure that covering is understood to be a human condition that we all have to work on removing if we want people to be authentic and clear when they're at work so that they feel supported.
You know what? One more point to Doug's point. I think that was a really fantastic way to reframe the concept so that everyone can understand how it might feel today, right? We are, in a truly complex time in this country, truly painful time in this country. And, with, of course, the global pandemic and millions of people who've experienced tremendous loss, right? Death, unemployment, obviously the current reckoning on race, and there is an emotional toll, right, to coming into workplace, virtual or otherwise, and pretending that's not something that weighs on you, and pretending that you're not connected to this type of loss in some way, either through a friend or a family member or someone you've worked with. And I think that's a really, really great way to frame the concept of covering and how it can be so onerous. It can be so burdensome over time when you're doing it, often.
Absolutely. And most people don't realize that they are, right? That they have been accustomed to fit into the norm and done the things that they do for so long that it's not even, it's second nature. Well, I want to go to, we've had a number of questions, and I'll start with the first from Facebook. The question is, in seeking better perspectives by a majority, what metrics of a minority's success can be measured as an example of their benefits to various communities? In parentheses, Main Street versus Wall Street, urban versus suburban, rural, economic, or social. So I'm going to let Linnea take the first pass at that. And then Doug, I've got a question for you, another from Facebook. And Linnea, I'm happy to jump in on that as well with a couple of thoughts. But
yeah, I mean, if you can, restate the question. It came in a couple of parts, but I just want to make sure I can.
I think the person's asking, what are the metrics of minority success? Why does having an LGBTQ minority be successful impact the majority? And I've got an example that I can use, but I think that's what they're asking.
Okay, great. I think, the metrics for success, when we're talking about LGBTQ talent, we would approach this in the way that we would for, any other cohort, right? And, we at COCO, we do a lot of research around, LGBTQ talent and other cohorts. And what's critical is really being able to determine what dynamics are at play in your particular workplace. So you're going to look at any barriers to success or advancement for Black talent, right? Access to senior leaders and visibility within the organization. You're going to look at, any room for bias or barriers that impact kind of their structural experience at the firm, whether it's talent acquisition, performance management in the way, teammates are ranked, feedback is given, performance is evaluated, even where bias creeps into pay decisions. And you would be surprised, that all of these things happen for LGBTQ folks the same way they do for women, Black and brown individuals. And so when you think about metrics for success and measurement, if you're keeping that cohort, it's, a kind of a human-centered approach to success, then you're going to look at retention, you're going to look at advancement, and you're going to be intentional about the ways that you can remove barriers to success in the workplace in order to support that particular group.
Thank you, Linnea. I agree, and I would add an example that I tend to use, which is that companies and leaders focusing on the LGBTQ community are focusing on an invisible minority. And I like to say that we're the canary in the coal mine of a company or an organization's culture, because what you do for an invisible minority sends the message to the visible minorities that you care. And the idea of taking from the margin to impact the whole is, I think, very germane to the LGBTQ inclusion conversation. And the example I love to use is actually sidewalk cutouts. You know how we have the sidewalk cutouts all across streets, right? Well, the reason that we have those, of course, is the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? So you have to have those for access. And roughly 5% of Americans are in a wheelchair at any given time in the United States. So we did something for 5% of Americans, arguably. But who uses sidewalk cutouts? Everybody. Strollers. The wheelie luggage industry was invented after sidewalk cutouts. Every human uses them. So we did something for a very small population that made it better for everybody else. And so I use that as an example for companies or leaders who say, well, LGBT people are only 5% or 7% or 10%. Why aren't we focusing on 50% of women? And I say, well, you know what you're doing for your transgender employees to break down gender norms actually makes it better for all the women in your organization, because you're breaking down the gender norms in your organization. So you took from the margin to impact the whole. And I think that's a second way, I think, to answer what this person is asking. There were a couple of questions about what companies and leaders can do to make sure that LGBTQ leaders feel safe and supported at work. And I think that leads us nicely into the ally conversation. And so Doug, I want to start with you on this, and I'll share a little bit of our data, and I know Linnea has some data as well. But let's just start broadly. Let's talk a little bit about allies, and I'd love to know from your perspective, one, how you view allyship, and if there are ways that allies have been supportive to you, but also if you would have advice for individuals, leaders, and companies who want to be allies, what advice would you give them?
For me, the concept of allies is something that developed over time in my career. I was not even an ally to the LGBTQ community when I was closeted, let alone an advocate. So I think this is another place where thinking about small steps that everyone can make is important, because you're not really an ally because of how you feel. You're an ally because of how you act. And so what are the small actions that you can encourage employees, and especially leadership employees, to take that will show that they are allies? And I think there's a really simple phrase that has come out through a lot of the pain recently, which I think captures it, which is silence is violence. And so I actually think silence and violence is a great way to articulate to allies what the difference between an ally and a not ally is. And so an ally is someone who believes silence is violence, who believes that they need to be vocal about how they feel, not just feel how they feel. And so that is really asking people, again, to be uncomfortable, because especially in my case, I could just cover and be a straight white male with privilege, because I'm not gay until I start telling people about my husband. And so unlike Linnea, I can become invisible, and I can tap into all the privilege. And privilege is easy and nice and very appealing. And so being an ally is walking away from privilege. It's taking a situation where you are no longer going to be the privileged straight white male who goes along with the jokes, who is quiet when someone is being left out of a conversation, who's not pointing out that the leader in the room is the black woman across the table, not the white guy who works for her. And those are awkward things to say, and they can really disrupt the flow of a conversation. But if you don't encourage and even require people to do that organizationally, it's not going to happen. So I think you have to set a culture of allyship, which really says part of your performance is to protect our culture, and our culture is inclusion. And so I really think that's the message around allies. Ally is I think you said this is a verb, is allies are not allies if they're not acting.
So I want to get on a couple things you said and then get Linnea's perspective here. One, allyship is very much about privilege. And I think sharing your privilege and sharing your platform, and this ties into the Black Lives Matter movement, right? The idea that sharing your platform with folks who would not necessarily have access to that platform is a way to get a broader message across. As you said, we actually at Leadership just published our ally research, and we'll share it with all the YPOers after this call. And we jokingly, but in all seriousness, say that ally is a verb. It's not a noun. And that allies, I always say, allies have to come out. Allies are built, not born. And it's our obligation as any of minority communities to educate our allies, to tell them what we need, but then it's up to them to move it forward. I did a call yesterday with Barclays, and there was a woman of color who runs Barclaycard, and she was saying that her best allies are the people that are allies when she's not in the room, because she can't be in every room as a human, much less a leader in the organization. And so allies do have to use their privilege, as you said, Doug, and they have to come out. And the idea that the final thing I'll say from Linnea's perspective is I actually heard at a conference this last year the idea of an accomplice versus an ally. And I want to share it because I love it. It's the idea. So ally too often can have this power dynamic, as you mentioned, sort of, imbuing power to someone who doesn't have it. But the idea of an accomplice is that someone is right beside you. They are literally beside you in the fight, and you are going together forward and pushing forward together and plotting to overthrow the patriarchy or whatever the challenge is. But the idea of moving even from ally to accomplice means that it is about action, and it is about being on the same team with someone, which I found very useful. Linnea, tell me your experience and what advice you would give to folks.
I love that idea of, understanding an ally is a verb, yes, but having an accomplice or a group of them versus allies. That sounds that much more powerful. That's about taking it personal. And
Right.
one thing, one point that I would add is that, to Doug's point, agree. This is, no longer is it sufficient to passively say I'm an ally. A decade ago, perhaps. 5 years ago, maybe. But I think, so perhaps giving opening remarks to your employee resource group from time to time was sufficient in the past. But, as leaders, the demands, the call to action has been heard. It is about the actions specifically that you're willing to make to eliminate workplace barriers, to foster a sense of belonging for everyone. It is about action. So I do. So one thing that Doug brought up is the idea of kind of discomfort. I think it's extremely important for allies or would-be allies and accomplices to listen, but also find a way to sit in that discomfort. Acknowledge what you don't know. Comfort itself is privilege, and we talk about that silence as violence. I love that as well. As you lead organizations, it's far better to show up imperfectly than to not show up at all. People tend to be tremendously gracious and will support you in kind of showing up better next time, whether it's not having the right language or not being unsure how you might act or how you might be able to support your Black and brown colleagues or women at the organization, your LGBT colleagues. I think it's important to just show up. One thing that's also important is for allies to demonstrate some awareness of disproportionate impact. It can go a very long way. At COCL, we recently launched a series of reports around belonging. And of course, we did a pulse survey around COVID, during that time as well. And we found that LGBTQ employees are far more likely than non-LGBTQ employees to feel out of place, lonely, anxious at work, both in the workplace, but then also in this kind of remote environment. And we also obviously look at most everything intersectionally. And so we know these feelings can be amplified and compounded at the intersections of race and gender. In that particular study, we found that Black employees reported that they were 5 times more likely to report a death of a family member from COVID than their white counterparts. For the Latinx community, it was 4 times, right? So we talk about what people might be covering, right? Disproportionate impact, trauma, the grief, they're not a fabrication. And so it's important to also at the intersection, think about where there's disproportionate impact. And then when it comes to just organizationally, I think it's really important, if you are an ally, you're activating your team and stakeholders in the work environment to think about how allyship can be woven into the culture, and I think that's an extremely important way to become an accomplice, right? Meaning I'm doing this arm in arm. It's not only what I'm going to do or commit to doing, but also what I'm going to pull others along to do as well.
Thank you for that, Anne. And I want to key in on something that you said, because it actually answers the question that we have from Facebook, which is, as people are on this journey of becoming allies, we have to give people the space to make mistakes. And the question was, how do you handle gaffes or mistakes in language or cultural issues, et cetera? And I'm curious if both of you have perspective. I'd share mine in that, as I mentioned, allies have to be built. And you have to be willing to be uncomfortable, as Doug said. But I also kind of jokingly say that sometimes you have to have a PhD in gay to speak about LGBTQIA+S. I mean, we don't make it easy for you sometimes, because we keep adding acronyms and letters, and there are, I believe, 43 different gender markers on Facebook that one can select. And as your average leader who has maybe an experience with a gay person, a lesbian person, maybe a trans person, but that's it can be really overwhelming. And too often we work with over 500 CEOs without leadership, and the single first and biggest question that they always say is, tell me what I need to know, and how can I not screw it up? And because of the fear of screwing it up, they say nothing. And exactly as you said, Linnea, And the challenge is in the LGBT community, we have the assumption of negative intent, which means if you don't say something positive, we will unfortunately assume something negative. And that's because of the discrimination that exists all around the world against the LGBTQ community. It's totally unfair and it's not a great thing, but unfortunately, saying nothing is so much worse than saying the wrong thing. And being gracious, as Linnea said, I think takes that to the next level of being willing to say, look, I screwed this up, and I called it, there was an example from Ireland marriage equality of a priest going around Ireland talking about a BLT, and he meant LGBT, but instead he was advocating for a bacon, lettuce, tomato sandwich. But his heart was in the right place because he was still saying that the BLTs should have the freedom to marry. And that was great. No one wanted to criticize this elderly priest because that was his perspective. So I want to see if either of you have thoughts on that, and we've got a couple other questions that I want to try to get to in our remaining time.
I actually, I think that's this whole idea of showing up imperfectly that Linnea talked about is really brilliant, because it's really tempting to demonize this idea that we're allies against this evil and we're going to go out and fight it. And the truth is that these are your colleagues. Most of them are not malicious people. They have bias that they're not aware of. They're really, I mean, a much friendlier term people use for other parts of life that are flaws that can be fixed are blind spots. So these are blind spots where they can't actually see that they have this bias. And so trying to put a little more empathy into the idea that we're all learning, and that if we work on learning together, we can get a lot farther, can make it a lot less scary for people who have these biases to admit where they are. And if they don't talk about it, then they're not going to be able to identify and fix some of the things that they're doing. So they're not going to notice that they're making microaggressions if nobody ever talks about microaggressions. And so I really think making it a safe place at the workplace to make mistakes and learn from them is really important for this conversation.
Absolutely agree. And I think taking that a step further, actually, Bob just asked a question in terms of, he wants to know about the advantages for an organization to focus on people showing up at work as their authentic selves, and if there is, and I would say, short answer, yes. And also, yes, there is a great deal of data that Allyship has done, that the Center for Talent Innovation and Coke have done on exactly that turnover decreases. Specifically, let's just talk about being out. The Power of Out 2.0, which I actually co-authored with Linnea's organization 5 years ago, was the first to actually look at the impact of being out on your career, on your happiness, on your engagement, on your willingness to stay in the organization. And we found that across every dimension we looked at, being out made you a better leader, made you more authentic, made you more likely to get promoted. Because if you were hiding something about yourself, people may not know that you're hiding your sexual orientation, but they know you're hiding something. And the corporate space is all about that hierarchy and being able to connect with people. And if you were doing that, you're not able to do that. You're not able to connect with folks, and it translates into depression. It translates into you leaving. People that are not out in their organizations are 5 times more likely to leave in the next 12 months than their out counterparts. And if you take that more broadly, I would use the analogy in the Black Lives Matter movement. I've heard from so many leaders of color in the last 4 months who have said that the Black Lives Matter movement has let them be more authentic at work to tell their stories of racism and discrimination that they have experienced in the workplace, but they were told, don't make the white people uncomfortable. You just keep that story to yourself. Gay people have been told the same thing. And our new Ally research says that the number one reason gay people don't come out at work is they don't want to make their colleagues uncomfortable. And so as you talk about this comfort level, Doug, as you were mentioning, all of these people feeling like they can be comfortable and they can share their stories. And when you share your stories, you connect and you're much more productive. The idea of covering impacting 18% of an employee's day, that's a huge lack of productivity. So I think that there's a huge data that we can share. I don't know if either of you have another comment on that piece as well.
Just one quick comment. The idea of, well, what can you do about this concretely at a company? Just a small thing is look at your exit interviews. Because you can actually see in that data, both are people leaving. You can actually ask questions like, do you feel like you were able to bring your whole self to work? Has it ever felt like you were trying to kind of cover your backstory so that you could get along or get promoted? And you can ask these questions in exit interviews. You can also ask questions like, how do you feel about the environment around unconscious bias? How do you feel about inclusion efforts in the company. And if you don't have people leaving because they feel they're too intense, then you're probably not actually doing much, because what you ultimately have are people who've joined your company not realizing this was important to your culture. And if you don't have a few people leaving because they just think it's too politically correct or too activist, then you probably aren't making the strides you think you are. So exit interviews are a really great place to figure out how you're doing in terms of asserting a culture.
I love that. I think that's great. You're pushing the envelope internally, and if you're not seeing some sort of pushback, then you're not doing enough. I like that. Another quick question that has come up in a couple of different contexts from Facebook and LinkedIn is around the difference in corporates and small business. And are LGBTQ people more successful, happier, more able to be out in small business, which we sort of talked about a little bit in the beginning. But just for the folks who are asking the questions, I'll ask you, Doug, this one. Do you feel like, compared to Hitachi versus Vinovolo versus being an entrepreneur, at what area do you feel like you were the most comfortable being out?
I think at the end of Vinovolo's story, which is the most current chapter, I was very comfortable being out because I had managed to grow a company with a culture that actively included cultivate community as one of its core values. And we more and more over time explicitly defined cultivating community as making sure to protect a feeling that everyone belongs. And that doesn't mean everyone. That means everyone who understands belonging is important belongs. So we don't care if people who don't buy into this idea of inclusivity don't feel like they belong. In fact, we want them to leave. And so internally and with our customer base, that was really an intention. And by creating that, I felt the most comfortable and the most like I belonged. Least comfortable was the beginning of my career at Hitachi, where it was truly dark on every dimension. It was racist, it was sexist, it was homophobic, and it was not a place where you were safe as any of those groups if you had any intentions of staying employed and getting promoted. And so I do think the corporate culture, which is largely determined by the board, the CEO, and the executive leadership team, is a huge factor in how people feel at work.
So I want to close our last question, but Linnea, do you have a comment before we do? Sorry.
No, we can move forward.
Okay. So the last thing I want you both to reflect on, if you would, is across the conversation that we've had today, what advice would you like to share with the leaders on this call on several areas, and you can pick whichever or all, on how they can create inclusive cultures, how they can drive diversity through their pipeline into the C-suite, how they and their organization should advocate for equality if that is something that is germane to their mission, and ultimately how they and as leaders can be better allies to the LGBTQ and all the minority communities. So I know that's a lot, but advice council perspective, what advice would you like to leave these leaders with? And Linnea, I'll start with you.
Okay, great. There's a couple of things there. As you continue to press towards more active allyship, as you continue to foster at least more inclusive culture in the organization, in the worlds you touch, quite frankly, I would say when you're thinking about pipeline and strengthening the pipeline of LGBTQ leaders, especially those with potential to reach C-suite, you have to be intentional, right? Have to be intentional about hiring, developing, amplifying the ideas of others, and promoting talent, quite frankly. If you want a senior executive pipeline, you just have to invest in it. Far too often at Cokewool, obviously we do study almost every cohort, we hear about this pipeline problem. And we hear about it with Black, brown talent, women, LGBTQ leaders when we think about CEOs and board diversity. But it's not a pipeline problem, right? When companies and leaders are talking about it, it's more likely a function of a stale definition of leadership. And I want you all to consider that. Or perhaps unchecked bias, homophobia, racism within the company that just prevents management from identifying and developing rising stars. So I wanted to put that out there as it relates to pipeline, something I'm extremely passionate about. And then when it comes to allyship, or kind of deepening from a takeaway standpoint, far too often, accountability and measurement, somehow become elusive when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. And so when you're thinking about, fostering inclusion for LGBTQ employees, when you think about advancement, not only retention of employees, but advancement, ensuring people are able to advance in a way that meets their capabilities and their potential, you really have to think about diversity, equity, inclusion being woven into the corporate culture, right? Leaders must know this is a part of the remit. It's core competency for leadership. Goals should be set, progress should be measured, and leaders should be held accountable just as they would for any other organizational priority. When I spend time speaking with organizations and their leadership teams, I remind them that day in, day out, you spend your time confronting complex business challenges, right? Driving innovation, meeting regulatory headwinds depending on the industry you're in, and when held accountable, we all find a way to push through, right? We meet the challenge and we indeed perform. So that would be one takeaway that I would love for everyone here today to hold.
What you measure, you impact. Right, exactly right. Doug, we've got just about a minute and a half left. What would your advice be?
So I think there's so much there. I don't know if I can cover it all, but for hiring people, make sure that you have at least one non-white straight male candidate as a finalist for every single hire, a manager and above. The pipeline is the result of people hiring people they're comfortable with, and they're comfortable with people who look like them and smell like them and act like them. So Midwestern straight white men are going to hire a bunch more Midwestern straight white men. It's not because they're evil people. It's because they understand the psyche. They think they do, and they're comfortable, and they can get to the idea of working with that person faster. So make it a requirement that your pipeline, your candidates, have representation, because there are a lot more non-straight white male people in the world than straight white male people. So the idea that one of the candidates is one of those people is not unreasonable. And if you still aren't getting to where you need to be in representation, make it 2 out of 3 of the candidates need to be. Bring real people to the table that are great, that can join your company and want to, and eventually you'll find yourself hiring them. So that's representation. Make it a core value of your company to make people feel they belong. You have, if you're at the leadership level, you have control over culture, and your culture can be, we are going to take a stand on this. And you'll find that people who care about that core value will join your company, especially if they know that that core value is built into your performance metrics and your evaluation systems, so that people are rated on how well they are making people feel they belong, helping people grow within the organization. You can look at metrics like turnover rates. Are your turnover rates worse for your people who are not of all the dimensions of privilege than the people that are of all the dimensions of privilege? If they are, then what is the organization doing wrong? Because it's the organization's fault that they're leaving. I think these are actionable. And then I think make this idea of bias correction friendly. So find an expression that people can use. We've all kind of gone through the journey over the years of calling out things that were sexual harassment or on the line. We've gotten organizations to learn how to be a little more watchdogs internally. On that front, we can do the same thing on inclusion. So find an expression that doesn't demonize the person who made the mistake, but does allow the organization to call them out really quickly and easily, so that you can keep course correcting and moving people forward. I think those would be the biggest things I give as advice. And maybe finally, give yourself a break. You're human.
Underscore on that one. Well, Linnea, Doug, thank you so much for sharing all of your learnings, for sharing your experiences, for importantly being out leaders in the business community, because as I said at the very beginning, that is how we will drive change all around the world to get to a more full, equal, and just society. So I want to thank you both for being here. I want to thank YPO for inviting me to moderate this conversation. I believe you can find the recap and the replays across LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to David Brown to provide some closing remarks.
Wow, thank you, Todd, Linnea, Doug. That was a terrific discussion. So thanks so much for taking your time and sharing your insights with our members. The LGBTQ network of YPO is proud to be a vital part of the broader YPO membership of global leaders, those who are committed to creating a diverse and inclusive community inside and outside their companies. So this episode of YPO Presents is just a small part of how our members are engaging with each other around topics of diversity, business, leadership, entrepreneurship. To learn more about YPO and how we're making an impact in real life, please visit ypo.org. And we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes of YPO Presents. Great. Thanks a lot.